Well, we're now in the second week of this new fall message series that we're calling No Repeats. Actually, we're calling it No Variance, No Variance. It's all about trying to find ways to stay emotionally and spiritually grounded during what seems to be, at least by my count, the fifth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The fifth wave we're going through now. And we need to find some ways to stay grounded. And to do that, we're turning to some ancient Christian wisdom. We're looking at some practices called spiritual disciplines that Christians have used to get through some of the most brutal periods of suffering and persecution in church history. And these spiritual disciplines are the tried and true ways of accessing God's grace, of growing in the spiritual life, and experiencing positive personal transformation. But you know, the problem is, discipline doesn't sound like all that appealing, does it? I mean, you know, for some people, discipline's kind of like a dirty word, right? I mean, it sounds harsh and demanding, like not something we want to do. But when we look back on it, we all know, looking back, that those things that we've been most disciplined about, you know, like work or school or spending time with family or exercising or eating right, those are the things that have given us the greatest joy and satisfaction ultimately, right? And just as physical and mental discipline result in some very fulfilling outcomes, spiritual discipline also fills up the most important part of us, our souls. Look, you can run a marathon, right? You can cram for exams, but without a healthy spirit, you're just going to be nothing more than an athletic robot or a callous genius. And so over this 5 weeks of this series, we're going to be giving you some concrete action steps that you can take to tighten up some of that spiritual flab so that you'll feel better and be able to get through what may seem like another tough season. Now, last week, we looked at the first of these spiritual disciplines, which is prayer. And we said that praying comes naturally to people who are in pain and suffering and in crisis. But for the rest of us, not so much. It's kind of like a battle, because prayer really is about entering into a long-term relationship and conversation with God. Imagine if you had a friend who never called you, never wrote, never emailed you, except when they were having some enormous crisis and desperately needed your help. I mean, I know what you're thinking. That's what my kids do. But we're all kind of like God's kids, right? And that's what we do to God, including me, from time to time. We just look to Him for emergencies and then forget about Him the other times. But prayer, to be consistent and constant in it, takes discipline. And so last week, we got started by spending a couple of minutes in prayer right here at Mass. And then I asked you to commit to 5 minutes a day, just 5 minutes and not a minute more unless you're kind of a prayer veteran. Just spend the 5 minutes in prayer every day at the same time, in the same way, the same place. And I hope, if nothing else, you have found a new part of the day to devote to God. Now, this week, we're looking at a spiritual discipline that gets to the heart of why so many of us are left feeling fragmented and fractured and frantic all the time. You see, the problem is that we rush hither and thither to try to acquire more things and do more things and be more things to other people. We rush around with a kind of misplaced sense of self-importance, right? And we just end up feeling hurried and strained. It doesn't really work out that well for us. It's not a good practice. And so this spiritual discipline that we're looking at today is going to help us it's going to give us a big counterweight to our tendency to try to fill up our lives with more stuff, to overschedule our calendars, and to become a little too preoccupied with ourselves. And this spiritual discipline actually comes in 3 parts, which we're calling simplicity. Can you say it with me? Simplicity, slowness, slowness, and smallness, smallness. You know, when I was in my 20s, I went to visit a friend of mine. She was going to go to her hometown where she grew up, and she asked me to come with her. And this was in a small town in the North Georgia mountains. And the family had grown up quite poor. But her sister had married a relatively affluent man, and they lived in an upscale neighborhood with their 3-year-old son, Brian, who was their only child. And so we went to visit her sister first. Now, Brian, like all children, wanted to show us his room, and he wanted to show us all his toys. He was excited to do that. And so we went into his room, and his room was beautifully decorated, overflowing with new toys and games and stuffed animals. It was kid heaven. Except Brian had so many toys that he wanted to show us, he couldn't figure out which one to pick first. And so he got flustered. And then he began to cry. And then he got angry. And he started throwing his toys all over the room. At one point, it got so bad, he was literally trying to tear apart one of his teddy bears. He was so angry and frustrated. It was a distressing experience for him and his parents and us. Well, later on that day, we went to go visit my friend's father, who also, interestingly, had a 3-year-old daughter. It was my friend's half-sister, a 3-year-old daughter named Amanda. Now, they lived in, literally, and I'm not kidding you, they lived in a 1-room wooden shack in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. It was like something straight out of Hee Haw. I'm not kidding you. They were really, really dirt poor. And so when we got there, we meet Amanda, this 3-year-old girl, and she, like Brian, was very excited. She wanted to show us her toys. And we're kind of looking at each other like, do we want a repeat of this? But before we could say anything, Amanda emerged from the other side of the room. And she came over to us, and she was carrying a small metal bucket, like the kind of thing you would use to mop a floor with. And in that bucket contained all the toys she owned in the world, all of which were secondhand, most of which were broken. And she gently lowered that pail to the ground in front of us. And carefully and tenderly, she picked up each toy one by one, and she handed it to us so that we could admire and discuss the toy. And then we would hand it back to her, and slowly she would put it back down, and she would get the next one out one by one through all her toys. She handled these toys, these broken toys, these Barbie dolls with one arm missing or a leg missing or something. She handled them as if they were priceless artifacts. What if you and I could live our lives like that? A little more simply, a little more slowly, a little more small. Wouldn't our lives be totally different? I think that's the message that Jesus was trying to get across today. It's the subtext underneath the gospel passage today. You see, Jesus was traveling through the region of Galilee with his disciples, and he was teaching them that the Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. Against all expectations, Jesus was painting a self-portrait of himself as the suffering servant, the Messiah as the suffering servant, weak and defenseless, as the first reading says, subject to revilement and torture. And his disciples didn't know what he was talking about. And on the way home, as they're going back home for some much-needed rest after a lot of ministry, they start arguing with themselves, among themselves, on the way. And when they get to the house in Capernaum, Jesus turns to them and he asks them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" Well, they are silent with embarrassment. But Jesus knew what they had been arguing about. And so they had been arguing about who was the greatest among them. Who was the greatest? And so he sits down and he gathers his disciples around him to give them an important lesson on discipleship. Now, the thing is, Jesus doesn't use a lot of words in this teaching. He just simply brings over a child, a small child, and places it in the midst of the disciples as an object lesson. Because, a child is naturally small and defenseless. A child is very rarely, a small child at least, is very rarely preoccupied with himself or herself. And certainly in those days, in the ancient times, they lived very simply, and life was lived more slowly. And so he brings this child over to teach the disciples an important lesson about discipleship. And that lesson is the spiritual discipline that we're looking at today. And it has three parts, as I said. The first part is simplicity. Simplicity asks us to be a little more like Amanda and less like Brian. Simplicity asks us to let go of some of our wants and desires that rule our hearts. And asks us to focus more on the uncomplicated gifts of life, the things that can't be taken away from us. The Bible says, in the second reading, the Bible says that wars and conflicts come up among people. Why? Because we want to possess more. We want to acquire more. We want to have more. Here's what St. James says: where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every foul practice. Now compare that with the simple gifts that God gives us. Taking a walk in nature, walking down the path on Tiburon Boulevard, looking out at the beautiful bay, watching a sunset, eating a simple meal with family and friends, unpretentious, just having fun, game night with the neighbors, or giving and receiving love, the simple gifts that you and I so often take for granted. But we shouldn't, because one day we're going to have to give up everything. We're going to have to let go of everything, including our last breath. And so living simply, I'm going to catch that fly. Living simply, I see you all struggling with him. Now he's coming to me. Living simply prepares us for eternity, where only one thing will matter. Now, the second part of this spiritual discipline we're looking at this week is slowness. Slowness. And here again, the child is a perfect lesson, an object lesson for the disciples. Because if you've ever watched a child, especially a small child, play, right? They're not in a hurry. They're not in a hurry at all. They take their time, they dawdle, they drag their feet, especially when you're in a hurry, right? They drag their feet, they want to look at the cracks in the sidewalk, they want to stare in wonderment at everything. They talk to inanimate objects like they're their friends, and they just linger over the tiniest detail. Children go slow. And I remember, I have a great memory from when I was a child. I was about 3 years old, and it was one lazy, sunny Sunday afternoon after church. And, in those days, there was nothing to do after church. There were no sports after church on a Sunday. There were only three channels. 3 channels on the television, and there was never anything good on for kids, right? And so there was nothing to do. So my brother and I decided to go out into the backyard, and I'm not kidding, literally smell the flowers. So here's a picture of me with my brother. I'm the cute little one, and we're smelling the flowers there in my backyard, and that's me on the left. I mean, look at that, pure joy, right? Pure joy. I remember being absolutely fascinated with the colors of the flower. I was intoxicated by the fragrant aroma. I was captivated. I remember this like it was yesterday, watching a bee extract the pollen. I wasn't scared of bees. I hadn't been stung yet. So I was watching this bee extract the pollen from the flower, and I was fascinated, and my soul was at rest. Friends, being in a hurry destroys our spiritual life. There's a pastor in Oregon called Pastor John Mark Comer, and he puts it this way: hurrying does violence to the soul. You know, Grubhub, who loves Grubhub, right? We all love Grubhub. Okay, nobody? Okay, yes, I know come on, you can admit to it. Grubhub will bring you food any day of the week, almost any time of the day or night, because guess what? We're too busy to cook now, right? We're too busy to cook. Did you know that pet sitting and dog walking are now a $2.6 billion industry in the United States, and it's expected to double within 5 years because we're too busy to walk our pets. My Apple Watch has to tell me when to stand, when to move, and when to breathe. I'm not kidding. There's an app on here. It literally says, Father Roger, it's time to breathe. I mean, we've gone mad, right? And yet, Americans, the average American spends 4 hours a day watching TV and using social media. We have time to slow down. We have time to slow down. Jesus was a very busy man. He had a lot of ministry, but he was never in a hurry. And he took time away for solitude. You and I suffer today from what's called hurry sickness. Hurry sickness. That attempt to try to pack more activities into a shorter amount of time, to multitask all the time. And we end up suffering from what a guy named Lewis Grant calls sunset fatigue, meaning we come home at the end of a busy day and we're so drained from running around and doing all these things we think we're supposed to be doing that we don't have the energy to give our best to the people we love the most. That's a problem. And the thing is, hurry sickness is very difficult to cure, I got to tell you. It's hard to cure. One of our staff members here told me a few months ago, she said, I'm turning over a new leaf. I am going to slow down and savor every moment. I remember she'd come into my office and she'd be walking slowly. She'd unpack her things slowly for our one-on-one meetings. Well, just the other day, I was in the back room back here at about 7 in the morning, and I saw her in the closet back there, frantically rummaging through some boxes, trying to get ready for some new event or some program. And so I kind of smirked and I said to her, "So how's the slowing going?" Well, she didn't. We're going to fumigate this church next week. So I said, "How's the slowing going?" And thankfully, she didn't slap me. She simply turned around and she said, "It's going great between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. Other than that, not so well. We all need to unplug. We all need to slow down. We all need to spend more time in solitude. Because life is too precious to miss. And those moments never come back again. Well, the third and last part of this spiritual discipline we're talking about this week is smallness, what John Ortberg calls smallness. Smallness is essentially unplugging from ourselves, the preoccupation with ourselves. There's a psychologist named Milton Rokeach. He wrote a book called The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. He is a psychologist working in a psychiatric facility in a town called Ypsilanti, Michigan. I've never been there, but he wrote this book, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti, and he was about 3 men that he had worked with for a very long time, each of whom sincerely believed that they were the Son of God, the Messiah. And he had not been making any progress for years with these guys, and so he decided out of desperation to put them together in a small group, a therapy group. And so he describes one time they're in this group, and one of the patients says, he says to everybody, "I am the Son of God. I am the Messiah that God has sent to save the world." And the psychologist, Rokeach, he says, "Well, how do you know that?" And the patient responds, "Well, God told me." To which another one of the patients shot back and said, "I did no such thing." We can live more simply. We can kind of clear out the clutter to live more simply. We can ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives to live more slowly. But until we've dealt with our egos, that Messiah complex that let's admit it, that we're the center of the universe, until we've dealt with that ego that is constantly bombarding us with the false messages that we have to be better, smarter, more intelligent than everyone else, that we have to achieve more and do more and have more, we're never going to be cured. We've got to work on smallness too, being small. Because we all have kind of this delusion of grandeur that we need to be better than other people. We need to have the best church in town. Oh, did I just say that out loud? But we have to be like better than the guy down the block, right? Jesus was the Messiah. He didn't have a Messiah complex. And that's why he tells his power-hungry disciples today that it's not about who is the greatest. It's about who is the least and who is willing to serve the least important, the child in their midst, like the child that Jesus placed in their midst, the nobodies of this life. And so this week, we need to work on all of these things because Jesus was the Messiah, but he was small. He made himself small. He died a shameful death. That's why the second reading says that he is the wisdom from above, who is pure and peaceable and gentle and compliant, full of mercy and good works. That's our goal, to become small. And so here's some action steps for you this week. I just want you to take one spiritual practice this week that we've talked about, either to live more simply, to go more slowly, or to be smaller in our own estimation. And so we're going to give you a sheet at the end of Mass. They're on the table outside with all kinds of suggestions. But here's a couple of things to think about. With respect to simplicity, maybe clean out your garage or your closet or your basement that you've been meaning to do for a long time and give it away. Give the stuff away that you really don't need. Maybe if somebody admires something that you have and says, oh, wow, that's really beautiful, give it to them if you can. Live more simply. Maybe decide one day a week we're going to have a simple meal, not an extravagant meal, a simple meal. When it comes to slowing down, intentionally drive in the slow lane of the traffic. I mean, I did that the other day going up to Healdsburg. I drove in the slow lane. It took me 2 minutes longer than usual, and I was completely at peace. I didn't have to keep up with all these maniacs who were driving in the fast lane. Or maybe do what my brother does. If you're flying on a plane, be the last to get off. Intentionally sit there while everybody else gets off the plane. It's an act of courtesy, and you'll be more at peace. You won't be part of the mad rush trying to get your bags down from the overhead, and being first in line and jockeying in position to get out the door first. Why bother? Or take the longest line in the supermarket. When it comes to being small, maybe perform an act of service for someone, an unexpected. Maybe do an extra chore at home. Mom, would you like that? Yeah. Do an extra chore that you don't have to do. Maybe pick up a piece of trash. Or if somebody yells at you, don't yell back. It's an act of smallness, checking our ego and becoming more humble. Try these things and let me know how you feel. I bet you'll feel better. You may say, Father Roger, why should I do all these things? What's in it for me? Got one word for you. Peace.